Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. I am your host today. My name is Ralph Amos. I am the Assistant Vice President of Alumni Relations here at Caltech and the Executive Director of the Caltech Alumni Association. We are delighted to come together in celebration of one of our Alumni Award recipients for the Distinguished Alumni Award. It's a really wonderful honor. The DAA, the Distinguished Alumni Award, was established in 1966, and it is the highest award bestowed upon graduates by the Institute. And this year is no different. Our graduates are outstanding who are receiving this award. And it is an honor to have Dr. Charles Elachi as our guest today. The application for the 2022 award process will open December the 6th. So please look to your inbox for that opportunity, and we encourage you to nominate yourself or others who should have an opportunity to receive this award. Now it is my honor to introduce this year's Distinguished Alumni Award recipient, Dr. Charles Elachi. If he could please join us on screen, that would be just perfect. Dr. Elachi is a 30-year veteran of the Jet Propulsion Laboratories. He's also a professor of electrical engineering and planetary science researcher. He still does as an emeritus faculty here at Caltech. As the director of JPL, Dr. Elachi oversaw news-making events such as the Origins program and deploying the Mars rover, complete with the infamous 7 minutes of terror. Welcome, Dr. Elachi. We're delighted to have you. It is also my honor to introduce Caltech's 9th president, Dr. Thomas F. Rosenbaum, who's the president of the campus and a professor of physics. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today and having this conversation. I will now leave the show with you.
Great, thank you, Ralph. And let me add my welcome to all of you. This is sure to be a provocative and inspiring discussion, knowing Charles well. Ralph asked me to start by explaining how Charles and I got to know each other. And I'm not sure that everyone knows that not only did Caltech found JPL, but that it manages it for NASA, which came 20 years later. So since 1958, we've been managing JPL. And the director of JPL is a vice president at Caltech. So there's a formal relationship that way where Charles and I got to know each other. But I must say that when you have the opportunity to learn from someone like Charles, it was a no-brainer to be able to try to spend as much time as possible and treasure the collaboration and just the excitement of JPL. And I have one small story I want to tell about very early in our relationship, which I think demonstrates Charles's ability as a showman and as an expositor of science and excitement. So I started in July of 2014. And my inauguration was that October, and the inauguration was on the main campus, but I went out to JPL that morning because I wanted to make a statement about the primacy of the relationship between campus and JPL. And Charles, of course, was director. And when I got out there and I gave a short talk, all of a sudden I look to my left and there's this robot coming across the stage and it's holding an iPad. Charles is laughing. And on the iPad, there's this big red dot and it says push. I'm thinking, my goodness, is this an idiot test? You know, if I push this, what's going to happen? But what it did, I did push it. But what it did is it sent the instructions that day to the Curiosity rover to tell it what to do. And where else but JPL, and where else but with Charles Elachi, thinking of illustrating the vast power and excitement from the laboratory. So Charles, I understand that you have you've put together a PowerPoint detailing some of your background with great pictures and all, and I'd like to invite you to share that with all of us.
Thank you, Tom. And I remember very well that that event, you know, at JPL. And first, I want to start by thanking the Alumni Association, the leadership of Caltech, and you, Tom, for giving me this award. I would consider it as one of the highlights of my career at Caltech. I started at Caltech about 53 years ago. I was 5 years old when I started, or at least I like to think that I was that old. So what I'm going to do is really not only tell you about my career, but tell you how Caltech impacted my career and what did I learn, from Caltech over this 53 years. So if we go on the next slide. So I grew up in a small town in Lebanon. It was like about 1,000 people, I think, when I was growing up. It was well known because it had the main military airport in the Middle East, first during the Ottoman Empire, during World War I, when it was part of the Ottoman Empire. And then it was a protectorate of the French. So during World War II, it was part of the French influence. And our home is just, it's hard to point it out, but it was just behind those tents that you see the military thing. So I was very close to an airport. I used to see airplanes going up and down. And then I remember very clearly when Sputnik was launched. I used to have a little Zenith radio, portable radio. I used to carry it with me everywhere. And I remember hearing that beep, and I was absolutely fascinated. I mean, I was about 10 years old at that time. And amazing enough, 3 months later, I used to receive a magazine from the American Embassy in Beirut called Life in America. And in that magazine, they talked about, JPL, this place called JPL launched Explorer 1. I still remember very clearly, even the Kalman was that, but I had no idea where JPL is. Or I knew where California is, but I had no idea where JPL was. So if we go on the next slide. So this is kind of my life in a nutshell. So on the left, you see me, my mom must have thought that I'm going to be working in space. So I'm that angel. She dressed me as an angel during my older brother first communion. I don't look like I'm very happy about it, but I think I kind of remember it at that time. And one big thanks is for my parents, because they felt that education was very important. So they made sure that my brothers and sister and I went to very good schools. First, it was a nun-run school, and then it was a priest, like a Jesuit order in Lebanon. So I grew up through a very disciplined education. It was a boarding school, that I went to. And then at the end of my high school, because we followed the French system, there was a baccalaureate, which is a national exam. And I was the only one who scored a perfect score in math and science. So I got a fellowship to go to France to study engineering. And that's the next picture that showed me biking, at the university in France. And there, the head of the school and my advisor was somebody that Tom, you would know about. It's Louis Néel, who worked in low temperature physics. And while I was there, he received the Nobel laureate for his work in so it was kind of exciting that my advisor got a Nobel laureate. Well, I did very well in the school in France, and a year before I finished my engineering degree, I was at the school called the Institut Polytechnique de Grenoble, which is one of the what we call a grande école in the French system. So they were the equivalent of the Caltech and MIT and so on. So anyway, I met two students, American students, who were studying French, and they wanted somebody to practice French with. So we kind of became good friends. And they kept saying, well, why don't you come to the US for your PhD? And I thought, well, I don't know. It's a complicated system. I mean, I already have a position in France. But anyway, they encouraged me. They told me how to apply. And so I decided, heck, there is nothing to lose. So I applied to the usual culprit, the MIT, Stanford, Princeton, and Berkeley and Caltech. So I got accepted in all of them. So I said, maybe I'd better go and look at the map, see where are these universities. So clearly I saw MIT in Boston, Stanford up next to San Francisco, and it was a tourist map I was looking at. So I looked for Pasadena, and I see a big sign next to it, Hollywood. And I was very much into American movies, the Errol Flynn and John Wayne. I thought, wow, if I go to Caltech, I had no idea how big Los Angeles is. I thought it's like Grenoble, which is about 100,000 people. I can go to the downtown cafe and watch all these who's who walking by while I'm having my coffee. But to make sure, I went to Louis Néel and I, what do you think about this Caltech place? He said, this is a great place. I would highly recommend it. And then another professor, just happened how things happen in life. Another professor told me, oh, when he was a postdoc at Harvard, his office mate was Charlie Pappas, who was the professor at Caltech doing electromagnetic theory, which is what I was interested in. So that's how I ended deciding on Caltech. I tell my colleague, not because Caltech was the best school in the world, but it was because next to Hollywood. Fortunately, it turned out to be the best school in the world. So here I show up at Caltech, that's the picture in the middle. That was, I think, my first months here at Caltech. And it's interesting, a few years ago, I showed it to our younger daughter. He said, gosh, Dad, you used to be good looking. And then she realized what she said. I said, but now you are very distinguished. So I enjoyed, Caltech was great and is still great. Every day was a very exciting day. All the faculty that I dealt with, all the staff I dealt with was always very friendly. Some of you might remember people like, Roy Gould, Charlie Pappas, Amnon Yariv, who's still, teaching here, Nick George. So these are all the professors. I took their classes and worked with them. And then a few months after I was here at Caltech, then I found out that JPL is connected to Caltech. So I remember the JPL of when I was a kid. And of course, I was very much interested in keeping track what's happening in space. Remember, that was the 60s. And I said, wow, what piece of luck that, JPL is connected with Caltech. So the second summer I was here, I applied for a job, at JPL, for a summer job at JPL. And I went for an interview, and the person who interviewed me, his name was Walter Brown. He said, do you know anything about synthetic aperture radar? So in the typical Caltech student, I said, no, I don't, but I sure can learn very quickly. So I came back, looked at what classes are given at Caltech, if any of them relate to that field. And it turned out Nick George was giving a class in optics, and part of it was about how synthetic aperture radar works. So that's how I started, in that field. And then when I finished my PhD, I was offered a job at JPL. So I said, sure, that sounds like a great idea. In those days, things were very simple. I didn't even fill in application form because I was already part of Caltech. So I just transferred, to JPL, and then I continued doing research here on campus of doing that. I always say I never received a paycheck which didn't have California Institute of Technology on it, from the time I was a student to all the way through my career. And so I started working, at JPL, and here at Caltech, I started teaching a course on physics of remote sensing. And in that course, I used to always pick the best student and encourage them to work at JPL. So people like Jacob Van Zyl, Alina Musessian, who's now a project manager, Charles Webb, who's now the head of all the advanced Earth missions, activity. And then a big break came in 1976. So that was a time when NASA was developing the space shuttle. And then the plan was that the first 4 shuttle flights would be completely empty, just engineering flight. And somebody came with a great idea and said, well, maybe we should put some instrument, in them, a high-risk instrument. And if they don't work, big deal. That's kind of high-risk instrument. So I decided to submit a proposal, and you see on the right was my radar group. That was in 1979, but they were all in 1976. And I'm that good-looking guy on the right with a mustache. But we were all in our 20s and early 30s, working in the radar area. So if we go on the next slide. So that shows actually the instrument that we had on the space shuttle. This is a later flight that it gives you an idea. And it's interesting that first experiment, which happened on the shuttle was from JPL, and I was the principal investigator on it. And there was another instrument also by another JPL called Alec Getz, who is also a Caltech graduate. So really Caltech had almost complete monopoly on that flight. So anyway, so we started developing it, a bunch of 20 and 30 years old kids. And then what happened about literally a month before the launch, I get a call from the director office. It was Bruce Murray, professor from Caltech. So I go to his office and he said, oh, Charles, I just got a call from the NASA administrator, and he's having a hard time convincing Congress about the benefit of the shuttle. And he sure hopes that that experiment you are doing on the shuttle will be successful. So I said, oh God, here we go. We were supposed to be a high risk, experiment. Fortunately, it worked perfectly. And it was a great experiment. So if you go on the next slide, probably the biggest thing about it was the ability of the radar to penetrate below the surface in arid region. So you see on the top is a picture, a photograph taken from the shuttle over southern Egypt. You see the Nile in it, and the picture below it is the radar picture, which actually show penetration through the sand and shows the old drainage channels of the Nile River. And through that experiment, we mapped all what we call the paleo channels in Northern Africa and the Middle East, which showed all the location of the old drainage channels, which are many thousand years old. And then they got covered with sand, and the radar, because we are using microwave, we were able to penetrate many meters below the sand and see the old drainage channel. This became a big hit. It was front cover of Science, because I had an article in it, front cover of National Geographic, front cover of Scientific American, and archaeologists became very excited because it could give them indication of where potentially old cities or old travel route used to be along these rivers. So that was a big hit, and the NASA administrator was delighted. Matter of fact, I remember he asked me to go and brief him in person, and after I briefed him, he said, well, do you have any other idea for a shuttle accelerator? Again, like the typical Caltech, said, of course, give me a week, I'll come back with another proposal. And we did, and he said, keep it for 10 pages only. And that led to a series of shuttle flights, Survey, Circe, SRTM. So we had 5 shuttle flights, which are dedicated to the kind of experiment using the radar instrument. So if we go on the next slide. And this shows that it led to a lot of field work, because we went with American geologists and archaeologists and Egyptian and Omani in the case of one of them, to go and verify what we are seeing. So we were doing digging. And it's interesting because it's not the kind of, you go to the nearest town in Earth and go. It was about 300 miles from any civilization in southern Egypt. So we had to have a group of Egyptian workers to take all our food, water, tents, transportation, because we spent about a month in Egypt in the early 80s. And to tell you a story, to have fresh food, they brought live ducks because supposedly ducks survive the heat very well. So one day we were asking the cook, because he had all the ducks in his tent, we asked him, well, how can you sleep with all these noisy ducks? He said, oh, it's no problem. Whichever is the noisiest duck, that's what you get for dinner that night. And he said, it's amazing after a few days how quiet all the ducks get on doing that. So anyway, and the other one was in Oman, which came from the next shuttle flight. And then in that area, actually, we were able to discover the remnant of what's called the city of Obar, or the fortress of Obar, which was mentioned in the Bible. That's where a lot of the frankincense used to be brought, in the Middle East and used by the pharaohs and the Roman Empire. And now, if you go and Google Ubar, then you can. It's one of the main tourist attractions in Oman. So if we go on the next slide, and this is an example of what these radar images. They look very much like colored, pictures. That was multispectral radar images, and now they are being widely used for Earth observation, which I'll mention a little bit later. If we go on the next slide. Then in the late mid-90s, and we made a major breakthrough where we decided to fly one of these radar instruments and then stick out a boom of about 100 meters long and put a second radar on it. Now, all the people listening are Caltech graduates. This is exactly like what you do with Fresnel interferometry. If you have 2 points or 2 holes and you shine light through it, you see fringes on the other side. And in this case, it's an equivalent microwave one. And these fringes are superimposed on the surface. So if you have topography, the fringes are kind of bent a little bit. And inversely, by looking at the fringe pattern, we can generate the topographic map of the surface. And this was revolutionary at that time, because up to that time, topographic mapping was done by doing stereo imaging, having hundreds of people doing contour maps on stereo images. And here, literally in 12 days, we mapped the whole world in a digital format and generated the topography from it. So if we go to the next slide. So this is example, now you see these images all the time. They all came from that 12-day mission that was done in the 1990s. And I clearly highlighted JPL and Caltech. We make sure they always look bright in the radar images on this one. So this basically led to a new way of doing topography globally. And now this is being used as a database for many, many applications. So if we go on the next slide. Then as I moved up, in the organization at JPL, then in 2001, this is a picture when David Baltimore announced that I was selected as a JPL director. I remember very well, I was teaching my class here on campus. It was, I think, on a Tuesday. And the president assistant, she walks in the class and hand me a little bit note that Dr. Baltimore would like to see you after you finish your class. So I go to his office, and in his typical way, David goes straight to the point, said, Charles, I want you to be the next director at JPL. Then we sat down and started talking about the challenges, and it was absolute delight, working with David for about 5-6 years. I mean, he was a great supporter, the same way with Jean-Louis Chameau and the same way with Tom Rosenbaum. We at Caltech are very fortunate to have leading presidents like those 3 presidents that I worked with, and they really put high emphasis on having JPL feel as part of the Caltech community. And in that event also, it was David was going to announce it the following day at JPL, but Dan Golden, who was the NASA administrator, asked him to delay it by a day so he can bring the senior manager at NASA headquarters. And you see Dan Golden a little bit to the left, you partially can see him there. So here I was very fortunate that I had the head of Caltech and the head of NASA there, and that led to a great period, what I call the golden age of space exploration. If you go on the next slide. And this shows the 24 mission, which we launched during the period I was director at JPL. So it was a very intense period because we had basically a launch every 9 months, roughly on the average, every 9 months. Everything worked great. We had 2 missions where we had few issues with them, but we were able to still meet all of the scientific, objective of those missions. And like I always said, if everything was perfect and succeeded perfectly, then maybe we are not pushing the limit hard enough. So everyone's having an issue, that's normal. Before I became director, we lost 2 missions, but we learned from them. We didn't give up on this thing. As a matter of fact, I remember when after I became director, I went and visited a few people in Washington, particularly on the Hill. So like David Dreyer and Adam Schiff. David was the congressman who was overseeing Caltech, or we were in his district, and Adam Schiff was the neighboring. And all of them, everybody said, Charles, we still want you guys to be bold at Caltech and at JPL, because you are really the place which is making new exploration. And yes, when you are an explorer, failures happen every once in a while, but you should learn from them and not be intimidated by having these things. So that was kind of the motto that we followed, at JPL. If we go on the next slide. So to tell you a little bit about these missions, this is a picture of Jupiter, amazing picture, which was taken by Juno, which was launched 2 days after I stepped down as JPL director, and is still mapping Jupiter. And many of my colleagues, here are still working on it, like Andy Ingersoll. And if we go on the next slide. And this is from Cassini on Titan, mission which spent 13 years mapping Saturn and all its satellites. And I was a principal investigator on the radar instrument which mapped Titan. If we go on the next slide. And we discovered, on Titan, all these lakes that you see, because the radar was able to penetrate, through the haze, which is around Titan. And on the left side, you see the sand dunes, which are on Titan. And if we go on the next slide. And that was another really exciting mission where we were actually took a spacecraft and shot a bullet into a comet to see what actually the comet is made of. And now remember, the comet is not sitting there, it's moving at very high speed, thousands of kilometers, per minute, and the spacecraft is moving at thousands of kilometers per minute. So we used to call it like hitting a bullet with a bullet. And that's what happened in here. And if we go on the next slide, and the one which is particularly proud of, I'm proud of every mission, and I love every mission that we have done at JPL. But one thing people don't tend to forget, that we, JPL, Caltech, and NASA, we have been present on the surface of Mars for the last 14 years. Day in, day out, continuously. We had rovers, basically roving laboratories, which are exploring, that planet. And here I want to mention this happened not because of one person or two people, but literally hundreds and hundreds of scientists and engineers at JPL and on the campus, which makes that happen. Just imagine you being the alumni from Caltech, this small institution here, this highly reputable institution is basically running the exploration program of our nation and having developed these capabilities. So you have people like Pete Theisiger, Caltech graduate, Adam Stetzer, Caltech graduate, Matt Wallace, Caltech graduate, and other people. We let other universities also participate. So we had people like John McNamee, Jennifer Trosper, and the faculty here at Caltech, like John Grotzinger and Ken Farley and Bobby Braun. They are all part of this endeavor, which led to the success of this endeavor. And other faculty, when I was the director of JPL, I had Jonas Woodzenes, Tom Prince, Paul Dimotakis, Dan McLeese. All of them were either chief scientists, chief technologists, which enabled that to happen. So the point I want to make that really Caltech played a big role in my career, not only as part of the education and not part of having great colleagues, both in EE and GPS, as well as in other divisions, but there were a lot of active participation of our great institute in these experiments. I mean, in these exploration. We go on the next slide. And here I want to show you one amazing thing, and that's the first Wright brother flight on another planet. And this one, before I left JPL, I made sure it was approved by NASA, even though there was a lot of pushback on it. So here you are seeing this helicopter flying on another planet. Just amazing accomplishment, which was done. And a number of faculty here helped, because I remember many discussions that I had with faculty on campus, like Maury Garib and Sunjo Chang. I talked with them, and we were able to use some of the labs here at Caltech to do some of the testing for that helicopter. And this is going to open a whole new field of exploring, the same way that rover opened a whole new field of a whole new way of exploring Mars. These helicopters are opening a whole new field of exploring, planets in the future. So if we go on the next slide, and this is another example of the role that the campus played. This is the Spitzer telescope, one of the big observatory in the infrared. And that was based heavily on work done on the campus. People like Gary Nogbauer and Tom Seufer and George Hillo at IPAC that were the lead players behind doing these telescopes. Go on the next slide. And then not to forget about our own planet, even in the 80s, I mean, one of the things which helped me in my career, it was a golden age at JPL in developing new instruments. So I was working on radar instrument, but people like Alec Getz, who's another alumni, was working on imaging spectroscopy. And there were a number of other people like Barney Farmer working in the infrared, Mus Shaheen working in the infrared, about observing our planet even before global change became a big topic. So this is an example where we monitored the ocean topography over a period of 20 years, and we see that the ocean is actually rising, at the rate of a few millimeters per year. And on that rate, 20 years from now, many areas will be flooded. And we verified that this rise is happening, number one, because of the temperature change, which is happening. So water expands a little bit. And if we go on the next slide, And that accounts for half of it, and the other half because of the ice melting in Greenland and Antarctica. So between these two effects, we can account exactly to the change which is going in the topography. We go on the next slide. And finally, I started meeting some movie stars. After I waited all these years, finally we had movie stars that I met with them. So you can see at the bottom, Jessica Chastain and Matt Damon came and spent some time at JPL, to see how before they did The Martian, Jim Cameron, also Jacques Cousteau. And by the way, Prince Andrew came, and I have to say that's the only time I dealt with him or I met with him. I know he's not as popular, today, but and I remember kind of tell you two anecdote in here. When I was selected by US News as American leader, we went to the event and my wife was with me. And after I made my presentation, this lady comes and talked with me for like half an hour about space and the excitement of space. And then when she left, I looked at my wife and said, she looks very familiar. Who is she? She said, oh, that was Glenn Close. I said, oh, shoot, I should have took her autograph. And at another event, Picard was present there. So I came and I introduced myself and as the director at JPL. I said, oh yeah, we come up with science fiction and you guys at JPL go and make them reality. So I said that was kind of cool, of doing that. So if we go on the next slide. And here probably when I retired from JPL, that was a really great gift from NASA and from Caltech is to put my name as the Charles Elachi Mission Control Center. I asked, can we add to it Caltech alumni? They said, no, that would be a little bit too long, but I'm very proud of being a Caltech alumni. And let me end if I go on the next slide. And for me, that's the three words I learned from Caltech. And that's what really Caltech and JPL and NASA are about, is to their mighty thanks. And that's a quote taken from Teddy Roosevelt, who is one of my favorite American presidents, where he said something like, it's far better to dare mighty thing, even that checkered with failure, than to sit in the twilight that knows neither victory nor defeat. And that's what Caltech is really about. And that's what I learned from Caltech is day in and day out, my colleagues here and the student and the postdoc and everybody, dare mighty things and push the frontier, of knowledge. So again, I want to close by first thanking my wife, Valerie, and my two daughters, Joanna and Lauren, who really supported me tremendously in my career, even that I was flying all around the world, and they were always very supportive. And again, to thank the Alumni Association and to thank you, Tom, for this award. So thank you very much.
Oh, well, thank you, Charles. And what a remarkable journey. It's really fantastic to hear it from you and to hear the influence of Caltech. And of course, you've influenced Caltech and the nation and the world so much as well. I'm going to now take a little time to ask you some questions and we can have a discussion. Then I will turn to quite a few questions that have been submitted by our viewers. But I wanted to start back at the beginning in terms of growing up in Lebanon. So how did that experience shape you and your view of the world? You talked about being introduced to space through the magazines and all, but sort of the larger cultural milieu, were there things you took from that were particularly useful for your career?
Yeah, well, when I grew up, as I said, it was in a little town, and I was always fascinated by the sky. And in those little towns, you see the sky very clearly. You can see the Milky Way. And I always wondered, could there be other people on those stars? I didn't know the difference between a star and a planet at that time. Could there be people on those stars actually watching us and wondering about us? And as I said, I was always curious about science, and technology. So I remember very clearly when the Sputnik, was launched, and then after when I read about Explorer. And like many people, I was very fortunate. I had really great science teachers. I remember very well our math and science teacher, who was always very funny and so. And I remember the first time he taught us how to calculate the area of a triangle. And man, for me, it was, wow, we can get the area of, and then more complicated feature, dividing them between triangles. So I think I was always curious about science. And again, having a teacher who was really kind of inspirational, helped. And clearly my parents were always very encouraging, particularly my mom. They didn't even have a high school degree, my parents. But they always thought that for their children to move up in society, education is very important. And fortunately, there were some great schools in Lebanon, many of them by missionaries from the United States, like the American University of Beirut, and by French, missionary. So I was lucky that I got very good education when I was young.
So it sounds like you always knew it was science, or was there another area that might have taken you off into a different career?
Yes, geography was and history were my other thing, because when I was a kid, I used to love collecting stamps. So my dad used to give me money to go and buy stamps, but he said with one condition, that every time you get a stamp from a different country, you go and read about that country, where it is, what are the rivers, what's the name of the capital. And he was very proud that his young son had all this geographic knowledge about it. And that's what I'm doing now with my grandson. He's very fascinated about coins, and bills,
Right.
which I usually, when I travel around the world, I always keep some of the currency. So I sent them to him. I told him with one condition, that you have to write up a one-page about every country that I send you a bill from it. And that's one way of getting young people to become curious and learn about things.
Now, what a terrific idea. So the rest of your life has been marked by a lot of travel, a lot of transitions. And the first one, of course, was to go to Grenoble. And was that a difficult transition coming out of Lebanon, a small town and everything else, or did that just seem natural to you? Or?
Well, it was a little bit of a challenge. It was the first time ever I leave Lebanon. I remember I took a ship, from Beirut to Alexandria to Naples to Marseille in southern France, and then the train to Grenoble. So that was a big deal. Fortunately, there were other Lebanese with me. And then also in Grenoble, the reception was really great. And as I mentioned, the professors there were always very helpful. They were not as, friendly as here at Caltech. I mean, there we have to call them always Professor so-and-so, Professor Nayel, or Professor. While here at Caltech, they told me, oh, you can call me in my Charlie or in my first name. And the first year I was here, I was invited to one of the professor home for Thanksgiving. I mean, you don't think of that in France. The hierarchy was very different. But again, it's like how fortunate things happen in life that probably the two professors which had the biggest impact, one was Nayel, who was recommended strongly to come to Caltech, and then Baltimore here, who appointed me to JPL. So it's kind of cool that I had two Nobel laureates, which had a great impact, on my career.
Yeah, fine taste. And then, of course, the next step famously was to Hollywood, Pasadena, and Caltech, JPL. What were your first impressions when you got here?
Well, it's interesting. I had, because I knew a number of American students in Grenoble, I always had a very positive attitude about Americans, that they was always upbeat, positive, they are really ambitious. I had all kinds of very positive things about the United States and about the life. And then from the movie, I thought everybody was like John Wayne and Errol Flynn and Bob Hope and so on. So I remember landing on August 15, 1968 at LAX. And then there was a family here, which Caltech arranged for me to spend a month with them. And they lived in Palos Verdes. So they took me to their homes. So I thought everybody in the US lives like in Palos Verdes. They had this gorgeous mansion. And then when I came to Caltech, everybody was so friendly. I remember the lady who was in charge of the international office. Her name was Ingrid. She was Swedish. And man, she was always very helpful, arranged, for the lodging in the graduate student house. And the professors were all. So I would say even that was my first time I come to the United States. Caltech made it so easy for me, all the staff and the faculty. And as I said, I enjoyed every day at Caltech, not only when I was a student, but after, with all the friendliness of the faculty and the administration. So I would say that made it a lot easier, being transported. That my English was a little bit shaky at that time, and even now my wife keeps telling me that my French is better than my English, but I got good training in France. So the transition was not too bad,
And your research, you've managed to keep up this whole time. So how did you manage that balance?
Well,
I asked with personal interest.
I love doing research and I love teaching. So even when I became director at JPL, I kept my finger a little bit in the instrument that I was developing. And I had a great team. All the people working with me, they kind of stepped up, even that I was becoming very busy, being the director. And I tried for a year to continue my class, at Caltech, but it became very quickly apparent, after 20 years that, I won't be able to spend the time, which is really fairly necessary. So then one of my previous students that, Jacob Van Ziel, bless his heart, he passed away a year and a half ago. So he took up over the class and he taught it, for almost another 15, 16 years. And now another colleague from JPL is going to start teaching it, this spring. His name is Paul Rosen, to do that. But I love being around students, and learning from them more than I'm, teaching of them. And as I said earlier, many of them really ended being careers at JPL.
Yeah, there's just this incredible satisfaction when your students become your colleagues.
Yeah, I'm sure you know that.
Yeah, no, that part is probably the best part of the job of being an academic. So you talked about dare mighty things. You were also known to live by George Patton's military dictum of take calculated risks. And so what was the most important calculated risk that you took?
Well, let me first say that, in the business we do at JPL, and the same thing on the campus, anytime you are exploring new fields, there is a risk with them. I mean, otherwise you are not exploring. You are doing things for the first time. You are opening new doors. So there is always a risk which comes with it. And the key question in my mind, two things is: one, you want to make sure you have the best team with you, because when the risk comes, you want the best team to be able to overcome it. And the other one, to sit down and thoughtfully understand what is the risks that you are taking and do the best you can to mitigate it. So clearly, I mean, I remember when we went to NASA about the sky crane, about landing, Curiosity with a sky crane. The first reaction was, you guys are crazy in California. You must be smoking something which is illegal, the rest of the country. What in the heck are you talking about? But we had people, who like Rob Manning and Adam Stelzner, who sat down and explained to the people at headquarters the approach and the calculator. We said, yeah, it is risky, but we believe we can do all the testing to mitigate that risk. So when we were actually landing the mission, we knew that there is a small possibility that it might not work, but we felt confident that we have done all the tests and everything that to mitigate that risk. And that's what JPL is great about. The engineers at JPL, they are great about. They don't sit down and sugarcoat things. We really look at what are the facts, what is the engineering facts, we test them, we verify things, and we know always there is a risk that you cannot mitigate, but that's what exploration is all about.
So you talked eloquently about the successes, and it's just amazing, and those pictures, and those are just a few of what can be there. But also you talked about the challenges and some of the failures, and which in the glare of publicity and everything else. And so how did you lead the lab through those times? People devote decades of work to this, and when it doesn't go forward, it must just be devastating.
Now, clearly, when failure happens, even that we expect that every once in a while, they are heartbreaking, for the team and for everybody. So I always made sure to tell the team, even before we do a landing or getting in orbit, that, hey guys, there is a risk here. So let's be prepared that there might be a failure. I know you did your best. We all did our best, but there might be a failure. And I want to assure you that as a director of that, I'm behind you. If the things succeed, you are going to be on the podium. If it fails, I will be on the podium. And I think that gave the employees the feeling that the leadership of the lab, and the same thing from the presidents of Caltech, they said the same thing, that we are in a risky business. We know we're doing our best, but we would be behind you if you did your best and still things did not turn out exactly. And I have to say, NASA has been very good at that. NASA, they are mostly engineers, they are mostly center directors or project managers, so they appreciate, failure. The shuttle failed twice and it was heart-wrenching, on that. And mission every once in a while, they do fail. So I think people appreciate that we are in the business, which is high risk, but that's how you move forward. But the key thing is to really make the employees feel that if we encourage them to take calculated risk, that we stand behind them. We're not going to let them, take the fall for it. And we say that's how you learn. It's like here on campus. When you do the experiments on the labs, they don't always work the first time. You do it every once in a while. You have setback and you learn from it. And that's what I tell the student I mentor. Be prepared that things will not work the first, but that's how you learn. Honestly.
So any advice for future aspiring JPL directors?
Yeah, I guess now you are in the midst of doing that decision. The key thing I would say for a JPL director, at least from what at a very high level, you have to be passionate about JPL, and you have to be passionate about exploration, because this is not a business for the faint of heart. The kind of things that JPL does, and you have to love the place. You have to love the employees for doing that, because that shows very quickly. For the employees who are there, are their leadership really are passionate and committed to what they are doing. I can tell you, Tom, I don't recall a single day where I didn't look forward to go to work, because I knew I would be learning something new, on that day. And every day, look forward to go back home to tell my wife and our two daughters, oh, we just landed on Mars today, or we're going to land on Mars tomorrow, or we're going to bring samples. So it's really the passion toward JPL and the passion toward exploration. And that has to show, for the employees to see it. That's what would be my highest recommendation.
That's great.
To the director and to you when you select the next director.
Thank you. No, that's wonderful advice. So my final question is, what's next for you personally? You're back engaged in research here at Caltech. You're traveling the world. How is that trajectory?
Well, I think I'm always a curious kid, doing, in my field. So now I'm involved in a couple of missions at JPL, but as a scientist. One mission to Europa, where we're developing a radar sounder to look at the ice, in Europa, that will be launched 2 years from now. And the other mission is an Earth orbiting radar. So I'm back to my original thing. I'm working with a group of faculty here about monitoring what's happening in the Middle East from the question of surface change using satellite radar interferometry, similar to the technique I mentioned to you earlier. I'm kind of coaching a group of 20 undergraduate students who are working on a project. They just finished it, and they were selected as the winners for one of the awards that NASA would be giving them, and they are already working on the next one, to actually build a robot. And then I'm on a bunch of advisory board, university like in Singapore, in Australia, and in France. I chair a committee on innovation, and even MIT. I'm on one of the advisory board, our sister institution, back east. So I tell people I just moved from 60 hours a week to 40 hours a week. And of course, helping my wife Valerie in digging in the yard and working in our gardens.
Those are the other 20 hours a week. Yeah. Well, we have some questions from our viewers, and I'm going to start with one from Evan Sang, who's a BS 1999 in EAS, and he asks, what's your fondest memory from a mentorship standpoint, either from being mentored or being a mentor, or both?
Well, one of my fondest one was from my advisor, Charlie Papa. So I was working, my PhD thesis was on, completely theoretical, solving Maxwell equation in periodic media. And I remember I used to come here on his office and write all my equation. And he was a gentleman with a pipe. And he said, well, Charles, after all this equation, does your result make sense? So independent of all the equation, does it make physical sense? So, and that stayed with me for many times, that always when people tell me about all these complicated things, then I said, does it all that make physical sense of doing that? So that's probably my fondest memory for people who advise me. From me advising, people, I used to always encourage them to, as I said, they're mighty things. And for the students first, they are intimidated and so on. But I used to tell them, that's how you learn. That's how you do. I had a high school student who, his name is Malcolm Tisdale, that spent his summer with me, and he was so brilliant. I told him he should apply to Caltech. He applied and he's a student now, here at Caltech. And he remembers that very well for what I told him. And he's the head of that team, which is working on this project that I just mentioned that won the award, from NASA. So these are my two fondest things.
That's great. Thank you, Charles. We have similar questions from Melissa Soriano, who's a BS 2003 in Business Economics and Management and Electrical and Computer Engineering, and from Betty Huang, who is the president, or just stepped down as president of and has a close connection to you. She stands on her own, but her husband, SL, I believe, was your roommate here in graduate school. And what is your most memorable experience or fondest experience at JPL?
Well, as I said, every day at JPL was exciting. But the most exciting thing was when you land a spacecraft on another planet. And because, as you said earlier, Tom, this is a result of like 10 years of hundreds of engineers and scientists working on it. And everything depends on those 5 minutes or 7 minutes of terror, that you see there. And then the excitement watching the people in the operation room when they say, oh, we just safely landed on Mars, and all the excitement. I mean, people were jumping, kissing each other. It's really, and I remember on one of the landings, it was during Jean-Luc Chameau's tenure, he was there, and in the typical French, he and I hugged and started dancing. In the mission operation room, doing that. So these are probably some of the fondest memories at JPL.
Yeah, it's just fantastic. Kevin Platsko, who's a doctor and a PhD 94 in biology, has a related question. If you personally could visit any of the places your robotic ambassadors have visited, where would you most like to go?
Well, I'll be honest with you. I like our planet. People ask me, do I like going to space or travel? And that's always fascinating to do that. But there is no place like our blue dot that we live on. And because of that, it's very important that we take good care of it, take good care of our environment. How do we, our biodiversity. So even that sometime, I don't mind sending robots to all these places. But for me personally, I like our national parks. I like, the environment we live in here. So that's my favorite place. Mm-hmm. It might sound funny coming from a JPL director, but that's the truth.
Brian Muirhead, who's the chief architect of the Mars Sample Return Campaign, asks a related question, which is, given JPL's extraordinary skills in systems engineering, all these robotic mission successes, are there new roles beyond what JPL is doing today that should be playing in fighting issues like climate change?
Well, first, hello, Brian. I mean, Brian has been a colleague. He has done superb work at JPL, one of the leading engineers that is at JPL. No question, global change is very important. And JPL as a national lab and as part of Caltech, we have responsibility beyond of what just doing exploration and engineering. So any area of our capability, be it engineering or science, that we can contribute for our nation and for humankind. It's something that we need to be thinking about within our sphere of talent. I'm not advocating to do something completely different, but the whole area of global change, what's happening to our planet, that's something that JPL can play a major role, at least in the observation and assessment of what is happening. So the policymakers, can basically get the facts of measure, because there are few people who are skeptical. And one of the key jobs I used to do when I was director at JPL is to go particularly talk with the skeptical, congressman, and show them the actual data that we are getting, like the ocean, the ocean rise that is. And in most cases, people are reasonably smart, and they do see, when you show them facts, they actually do see that that's something serious that we need to be paying attention to. So I'm delighted that JPL plays a significant role in Earth observation in addition to our planetary, activity. Matter of fact, I will tell you a little story here, if we have a couple more minutes, is that most of the instruments developed at JPL and the scientists who came to JPL, they wanted to put their instrument on planetary mission, including me. I wanted to put it for a mission called Venus Imaging Radar. But then the opportunity were not very often for planets. So we turned our attention to, in the 80s, to look at Earth and put these instruments. So it was a fortunate thing that, that we were able to use our planetary capability to put them and look to our own planet.
Yeah, it's so important that you did it many years ago, because the longitudinal data, of course, is just absolutely essential to be able to track what can be slow changes, too fast for us, but not on a year or two basis. I think we have time for one more question. This is from Peter Bloomfield, and he talks about the changes now in the relationship of NASA and commercial space flight, certainly in low Earth orbit. And how do you see the role of joint ventures between JPL and some of these private launch companies?
Yeah, no, I'm first delighted that there are private companies which are getting engaged, be it in the launch vehicle or spacecraft or internet, because the way I see the role of JPL and NASA is that the government develop new capability and new technology, and then turn it over to the private sector to actually capitalize on it. So I'm delighted to see SpaceX and Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic and so on, and a lot of small startup company capitalizing on the technology that NASA developed and paid by the taxpayer, by you and I and all of us listening here, and make an industry out of it, or enhance our economic capability. So I always was very supportive of collaboration with the commercial sector within our charter. Our charter was not go and sell stocks and develop it, but it was develop capability and technology and then help the private sector. And again, as everybody knows, and particularly Tom, JPL transmit all its new knowledge and new technology to anybody who want to use it. Fortunately, Caltech gets a first stab at getting the licenses for it, and that's perfectly the kind of things that JPL and NASA should be doing, and Caltech developing new capabilities and then makes them available for the private sector.
Great. Well, thank you, Charles. Thank you for everything today, and of course, much broadly, everything you've done for JPL and Caltech. And it's just been a pleasure to have a chance to chat a bit. I want to congratulate you on the DAA, of course, and I want to thank everyone for joining us and remind you that this session was recorded, and you can watch it again or tell your friends to watch it. It will be online shortly. So thank you again, and look forward to the next occasion.
And thank you, Tom.